Amen. Verses 25 to 30 we want to look at. But verse 25, Paul writing to the Philippian believers, he said, "Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labour, and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants." Sir Henry Frere was a British colonial administrator in the 1800s, but he was known for really being someone who loved to help other people, a true lover of service and a true lover of helping others and being a blessing to others. And on one occasion he was in India. He just arrived in India and he was staying in a little village, and someone from the little village was sent to collect him and to bring him to the little village. And his mother was already there and staying in the little village, and he was going there. And of course the person came to the mother and essentially said, "Well, how are we going to recognize this man? We've never met him before. How are we going to recognize Sir Henry Frere?" And his mother said this: "Look out for someone helping someone else." And sure enough, when that servant reached the station where Frere was dropped off, he saw a man, a gentleman, and he was helping an old lady down off the train onto the platform. And so his instinct got to him, and he walked straight up to him and said, "Well, are you Sir Henry Frere, sir?" And he said, "Yes, I'm Sir Henry Frere." And folks, over the last few weeks, we've been on the lookout ourselves for shining examples in this Philippian church. Men who were marked out, men who were really remembered for being individuals who helped others, who were a blessing to others. And we have found two exceedingly great candidates in these men, Timothy and now Epaphroditus. We looked at Timothy last week, and we looked at him as a shining light to emulate. Remember, Paul has been exhorting this church to be shining lights. Philippians 2 verse 15, "Amongst whom ye shine as lights in the world," the end of verse 15. He has told them to shine as lights. Christ, of course, has come. He was the light, and he has then told them to shine and to radiate that light. And then, as I've said, he has given them these two examples, these two patterns to follow. And we come to Epaphroditus this week. Paul, of course, was imprisoned in Rome. And when the Philippian church heard this, they wanted to help him. They wanted to send a gift to him. Actually, if you read chapter 4, verse 18, you'll discover that they sent some form of tangible gift to Paul to be a help to him and to encourage him in prison. But of course, they sent it as well. Just look at chapter 4, verse 18. "They sent it by the hand of this man, Epaphroditus. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odour, a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God." So they had sent the gift to Paul in Rome by the hand of this man, Epaphroditus. But Paul makes it clear here in chapter 2, verses 25 to 30, really, that obviously whilst he was thankful for the gift, the real gift that they sent was the giver of the gift, was Epaphroditus himself. And he makes that abundantly clear. Chapter 2, verse 25, the verse that we read, "He was your messenger." In other words, he came in your behalf, but he ministered to my wants. It wasn't as if Paul wasn't thankful for the gift. Don't get me wrong, of course he was. But he was saying that the real blessing that you sent was this man Epaphroditus. This man who came, and in verse 25 it says, "ministered to my wants." You see, it seems that Epaphroditus wasn't just content to be a postboy or some form of messenger and just drop off the gift and head home again. No, he stayed there. And he laboured with Paul as best he could, and he laboured, of course, for the cause of Christ in Rome. Epaphroditus himself was a preacher, was a teacher, was a pastor. And when you read other portions of Scripture, and even taking the detail here, I don't think it's wrong to suggest that whilst in Rome, he preached the gospel. But he did more than that, didn't he? He ministered to the wants of Paul. He was a blessing to Paul. Verse 30, Paul puts it this way, "not regarding his life." And the Greek really that has the idea of hazarding your life. Or as someone has even translated, gambling your life. And I'll explain through the course of the message what I mean exactly by that. But you think of this. This is someone who put their neck on the line. someone who hazarded his very life for the cause of Jesus Christ. In other words, he went there and he stayed there. He didn't necessarily have to stay there for the length of time that he did, but he took it upon himself to stay there, be a blessing to Paul. But this would have been dangerous, remember. Paul was in Rome, Paul was a prisoner, and so to associate with a prisoner in Rome was an extremely dangerous thing indeed. Now, as Epaphroditus stayed there and gambled his life, or hazarded his life for the cause of Christ, something happened. He took ill. He took seriously ill, much more serious than my illness this week. Very, very ill. In fact, verse 30, it says here that he was nigh unto death. And so he stayed there and he took ill, and it seems that he took ill because of his work, because of the cause of Christ. Because it says really there, because of the work of Christ, he was nigh to death. So this work that he was engaged in actually caused him to nearly die. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that he had some form of illness that nearly killed him? Does it mean that he himself was sort of hunted down because Rome, of course, was against the gospel? Well, we can't really be too sure. We don't really even know what his illness was, but whatever it was, because of that, he nearly died. Now, after a period of convalescence, Paul then sends Epaphroditus back to the church at Philippi. That's why he says in verse 29, receive him therefore in the Lord with gladness and hold him in reputation. So he sends him back to tell them of how Paul was getting on, and sends him back to be a blessing to them. But the thing that really sums him up, folks, and the thing that really sums up this portion, I believe, is his name. Because his name literally in the Greek means lovely, pleasant, charming. That's really what this man was. He was a lovely Christian, not in the sense that he was timid because he nearly died for the work of Christ, but lovely and pleasant and charming in the sense of the work that he performed, in the sense of how he conducted himself and how he was a blessing, a real blessing to the Apostle Paul as he was weak and as he was in Rome. And it seems that Paul just was immensely and immeasurably blessed by this man. And isn't it interesting that after telling them to shine as lights in verse 15, he speaks of the service of someone who they knew, someone who stood out, who shone well, and someone who was charming for the gospel. And folks, in a sense, that's what we all should be, isn't it? The shining Christian really is a beautiful, a pleasant, a charming Christian. Shining for Christ should lead to you a pleasant life. So I wonder, can people say that about your life, that there's no guile in that life? That it's a beautiful life, and you know what I mean by that. It's a fragrant life, it's a life that tells, it's a life that shows, it's a life that shines, it's a life that really you're just a pleasant Christian to be around. So many people have actually, whenever they're preaching on him, would call him Mr. Charming. I'm not going to do that today, but I think you know what they're getting at. This is a pleasant, a beautiful, a shining Christian, a Christian that we all should seek to be, a Christian that I believe God in Christ would have us all to be. You think way back in the Old Testament of the Shunammite woman, and in chapter 1 of Song of Solomon, she doesn't feel herself to be beautiful. She doesn't feel herself to be pleasant. She says in verses 6 and 7 that she was black but comely. She didn't feel herself to be beautiful at all. And yet how did her beloved view her? Song of Solomon chapter 7 verse 6, how fair and how pleasant thou art, O love for delights. He's viewed her as pleasant. And that's not just her physical appearance. That's her conduct. That's her character. That's how she presented herself to her beloved and amongst society. Are we a pleasant Christian this morning? Because if we are to shine for Jesus Christ in these days, we must know what it is to be a pleasant, a beautiful, a charming Christian. So let's look at this man today then. Let's think about another shining light to emulate, but really think about what it means to be a pleasant Christian. The first thing I want to show you this morning are his appellations. His appellations, what does that mean? Well, if you are upheld something, you're named it. And it's interesting because there's three names that Paul, before he even speaks of his work, there are three names in verse 25 that Paul gives to Epaphroditus. Look at them again. Verse 25, I suppose it necessary to send to Epaphroditus, my brother, companion in labour, and fellow soldier, your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. And it becomes apparent very, very quickly that these names, these designations, these appellations, they're different. Of course they're different. A brother's different to a soldier, obviously. When you bring them together, that shows you what a charming, that shows you what a pleasant, that shows you what a fragrant Christian is and what a fragrant Christian should look like. So in these appellations, look at the first one. He's described as a brother, and we think about his sympathy here. That's his sympathy. Verse 25, Epaphroditus, my brother. Now, this isn't just a generic throwaway statement by Paul. Paul's words are weighed. He's in prison. And we can gather that because of what he described Timothy as. Do you remember what he described Timothy as? Verse 22, that, the proof of him, a son with the Father, he has served with me in the gospel. So he describes Timothy as a son to him. But he describes here Epaphroditus as a brother. Now that's very interesting. He's definitely not a natural brother to Epaphroditus, because these three men, Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus, they all have different ethnicities or nationalities. The Apostle Paul himself was a full-blooded Jew. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, wasn't he? Last week when we looked at Timothy, we found out that his father was a pagan, Acts 16, but his mother was a Jewess. And most are agreed that Epaphroditus, well, he himself was a converted Gentile. He was a Greek. He was a pagan. So they're all from different nationalities, different ethnicities, but they're all from the same spiritual family. So why is it then that Paul doesn't call Epaphroditus a son like he does Timothy? And it's very simple. He's indicating the closeness that Epaphroditus had to him. You know what it's like. We all have our friends, but we are close to our family. I trust anyway you are. I have one brother myself, and we're extremely close. Extremely close. And you have brothers and sisters. And you know what it's like. You can tell your siblings virtually anything. And even when you're with them, they know what you're thinking. They know you. They know you inside out. Perhaps even better than your children. And you know what it's like when you go through a difficult time. You trust that your brothers, your sisters, your family, they show you brotherly and sisterly love. They're the first ones there. There's the closeness there, I believe. That's what Paul's really getting at here. He was a brother to me. When he came and he ministered to my wants when I was in Rome, he was just like a brother, even though nationally they weren't brothers. They weren't related at all by blood, yet they were in the same family. But more than that, he cared for Paul as a brother. You see, the shining Christian is someone who possesses brotherly love. Now, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And this appellation, this designation that he was a brother is showing you, child of God, that we should always strive to reciprocate, strive to show, strive to display brotherly love and sisterly love amongst the church of Christ. That's how you shine, child of God. Remember, shine as lights, verse 15. How do you shine? You be like Epaphroditus, and you possess brotherly love for those in the Lord. And so he was a brother, that's his sympathy. But also he was a companion in labour, verse 25, and that of course speaks of his service. Verse 25, I suppose it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion in labour. So he was a fellow believer, he was a fellow brother, but he was also seeking to bring others into the family of God. They were both part of the same spiritual family, but that didn't lead Epaphroditus to sit back and just enjoy the family. No, he did, because he ministered to his own brother in the faith. But as a believer, his business was to seek to bring others into that family. He was a companion in labour of Paul. Paul, of course, was someone who loved the work of God, who loved the Christ of God. And it was the same with Epaphroditus. Now you can see that obviously in his temporal service. He brought this love gift to Paul in Rome. But I believe it goes beyond that. It goes to his preaching of the gospel. It goes to his reaching out and his extending the gospel for Jesus Christ in Rome and even in Philippi. And Paul could write of this man to the Philippian believers because they knew Epaphroditus' work amongst them even in the preaching of the gospel and in the reaching of others. And so, child of God, you're shown here that there must be a balance in the Christian life. Yes, we need to show love to those within the family, and we need to enjoy being part of the family. What good is it being in a family if you don't enjoy being part of the family? We must enjoy being part of the family of God, but, child of God, we should always be seeking to bring others into the family of God. So are you just perhaps overemphasizing the brotherly love, the fellowship, and maybe just underemphasizing the furtherance of the gospel? There should be both in your Christian life. And so he was a brother and a companion in labour. He was a brother. But he also, verse 25 again, he was a fellow soldier. And that's his struggle. Thought about his sympathy, his service, but also Epaphroditus' struggle. Verse 25, my brother, companion in labour, and fellow soldier. Paul, of course, was an old soldier, wasn't he? What did he say when he was writing to Timothy at the end of his life? He had fought a good fight. He had finished the course. He had kept the faith. He told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, no man that warreth entangleth himself in the affairs of this life. Why? That he may please him who has chosen him to be a soldier of Jesus Christ. And so Paul, he himself has been in the battle, and it seems his days in battle are coming to an end. But he describes Epaphroditus as a fellow soldier. Someone who has stood shoulder to shoulder with him in battle. Someone who has been in the war, who has been in the battle, who has fought a good fight just like myself. We've warred together, we've battled together, we have fought together. And so Epaphroditus here was someone who knew what it was to struggle and to stand for Jesus Christ. Are you getting the picture of what a fragrant Christian, what a pleasant Christian, what a beautiful Christian life looks like? It's one, yes, that fellowships in the gospel. It's one that furthers the gospel. But it's also one that at times fights for the gospel. But folks, the point is this, is that we must have all three. We must have all three if we're going to be pleasant, beautiful, blessed Christians. Just like Epaphroditus, he was a charming Christian. You want to be a charming Christian today? That, of course, necessitates that you fellowship in the gospel, that you exhibit brotherly love, but that you seek to further the gospel. But also when the opportunity comes and when the need arises, that you know what it is to stand shoulder to shoulder with fellow soldiers and fight for the cause of the gospel. We must have all three. Because if we don't, you know what you find? You find that a Christian who overemphasizes one or underemphasizes the other, well, it's a bit like when the wheel alignment is gone in your car. And you know what it's like, the wheel alignment go and very soon your tires will go and you need to get them looked at. It's the same in the Christian life. We must have balance. Now, this church was a balanced church. I think that's very interesting. Because everything that Epaphroditus was, this church was, the Philippian church. If you look at chapter 1, verse 5, what did Paul speak of? He thanked God for their fellowship in the gospel. Chapter 1, verse 12, he spoke of the furtherance of the gospel, didn't he? Chapter 1, verse 27, what did he say? Striving for the faith of the gospel. And so in laying down the foundation for this church, and remember, as I've said, this was probably the best church that Paul wrote to in terms of error. There was very little error there. Their problems were mainly domestic, and yet they were still a great church. What does a great church look like, folks? It is a church that possesses all of these character traits. A church that seeks to further the gospel. A church that at times has time for fellowship in the gospel and sharing in the common faith. But also when the time comes, a church that stands for the faith of the gospel. And where there is an absence of one of these things, and look, there are other things, but they're here, so we deal with them. Where there is an absence or an overemphasis of one of these things, either in a congregation or in an individual, you find an imbalance. You find the wheels beginning to get wobbly, and eventually the car will go the wrong direction, so to speak. And so that's a challenge for us, an oversight here, isn't it? Brethren, yes, we should always seek to further the gospel, but especially those who are in oversight, let's not forget the folks in the gospel. And also there must be the fight of the gospel as well. And Christian, don't forsake any of those things. That is what will lead to you being a fragrant Christian. Now, I want to show you what happens if you overemphasize or underemphasize some of these things. If you're a Christian that's all about fellowship, then you're really just coming to church for a social club. You're just coming for friends. If there's no fight to your faith, or there's no seeking to further the gospel, you're just here. And really you could get what you get here in other places. You're just a social Christian. But conversely, if you're here and it's just to constantly warfare, and you forget that actually impacts the furthering of the gospel, or you forget about fellowshipping with other believers, then what really happens is you just become someone who fights all the time. Now, we need to fight. Paul says this, that he was a fellow soldier concerning Epaphroditus. But there must be the balance of the caring for the saints, the sharing of the faith, and the standing for their faith. There must be all three, child of God, in your Christian life. I cannot overemphasize this enough. Likewise, if you're all about furthering the gospel, now, as Christians in a sense we should always be, but there needs to be other activities in our life as well. But if you're all about furthering the gospel all the time, you know what you'll find? And I've seen this and I've observed this in Christians. You'll become an exhausted Christian because you're always doing and always running, and you never have time to encourage someone and either be built up by someone or build someone else up. I never have time for the fight of the gospel and realize that there does need to be a time to stand taken. So there needs to be a balance if you're to be a pleasant, a charming, a beautiful Christian. And it's the same with this congregation, folks. And may God ever, by His Spirit, make us a fellowshipping, a furthering, and a fighting church, in a good sense. Warren Wiersbe said that, there should be the 10th Beatitude. Of course, there's 9 Beatitudes in Matthew. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful. And he said there should be a 10th one, blessed are the balanced. And I know what he's getting at there. And there does need to be that. Some years ago, a famous preacher was driving along a motorway and he noticed a freight truck and flying along and going far quicker than it should have been. And there was a sign on the back saying, "At your service, any load, any time, any distance, anywhere." And really that should be the motto of the Christian. Any load. We bear one another's burdens any time. We be willing to help whenever we can. We go the distance. We go anywhere. That's what the fragrant, pleasant, balanced Christian life looks like. So we have here this other shining light to emulate. We have here his appellations. We'll move quicker through these thoughts. Secondly, look at his activity. His activity, verse 30, because of the work of Christ, he was nigh to death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service towards me. As we already mentioned, the Philippians sent him to Paul to bring this love gift to him. To Paul, that is. In chapter 4, that says, chapter 4, verse 18. But when he arrived in Rome, he showed himself to be a brother, to be a fellow soldier, to be a fellow labourer. He ministered to the wants of Paul. He cared for Paul. And the phrase, verse 30, not regarding his life, as I've said, it's a very unique phrase. It's actually only used here in the New Testament, and it's parabolani. Now, I give you that word because in the New Testament, the New Testament Christians, sometimes they were actually nicknamed in Greek culture the Parabolani. In other words, they were nicknamed the gamblers, the risk takers. That's what was one of the nicknames of the early Christians, taken directly from this phrase in verse 30. Now, what did society mean when they called the early Christians this name, the Parabolani? Well, of course, Christians in the early days, in the early church, they were those who visited those who were imprisoned for the sake of the gospel. They were those who ministered to the sick, who cared for the dying, weren't they? They were someone who gambled in that right proper sense, gambled their life for the cause of Jesus Christ. Do you remember what Paul said concerning Priscilla and Aquila? Romans chapter 16, verses 3 and 4, who for my life laid down their own necks. And so Epaphroditus, what you really see here is that Epaphroditus, he gambled himself in the true sense, in the right sense. He gambled his life for the cause of Christ as he went to meet with Paul. And you know, what a tragedy, child of God, it would be if you kept back. If you kept back for God. If you reserved. If you restrained. And you kept back something that God has given you. What you're being shown here is that there must be, if you're going to be a pleasant Christian, a blessed Christian, if you're going to be a blessing to others, there needs to be, in that right sense, the gambling of our lives. And you know what I mean by that. The going the extra mile. When the circumstances maybe, I don't know what's going to happen there. And I mean in the right sense. That you be a Parabolani like the early Christians. That you be like Epaphroditus. Now Epaphroditus didn't know when he was going to get there that he would almost die. But he went. Now let's look at this. Verse 30, because of the work of Christ, he was nigh unto death. Verse 27, indeed he was sick, nigh unto death. Remember, as I said, when he was there, he was preaching the gospel in Rome. He wasn't just there visiting solely Paul. He didn't spend every hour of every day with Paul. Rome at that stage was the citadel of politics, of economics, of sociology. It really was the citadel of the world back then. And so Epaphroditus, what does he want to do? He wants to strike a blow right where it hurts, right at the heart of Rome. And he preaches the gospel there. And so I want you just to imagine Epaphroditus. Think about his activity. He's coming and going from prison. He's gambling, as it were, with his life. And then he goes and he preaches the gospel there in Rome as well. And again, there's a gamble there. He might be arrested himself. Here was someone who, just like the Apostle Paul, when he himself went to Philippi, he was described, wasn't he? Him and the others in the missionary party. These are they which have hazarded their lives for the cause of Jesus Christ. Verse 27, the word sick means without strength. It's my own thought, but and so just for what it is, some commentators think this as well, but this man, just as we would say, worked himself to death. Worked himself to burnout. That's really my thought on Epaphroditus, and perhaps some infirmity came. You know what happens? You get tired and exhausted, and the body's open to weakness, etc. The word sick, without strength. He was without strength to go on. He literally, physically couldn't go on to the point where he was near to death. He worked himself to death, as we would say. What commitment. Don't hold back, child of God. And I mean that. Yeah, we need to care for ourselves, don't get me wrong, but we only do have one life. And as vapor, it is quickly passing away. And as the months and as the years progress, I'm sure that you're fully well aware of that. That we only have one small life. Does the psalmist not say that our days are like the shadow that declineth? You know what it's like? You see the shadow, and all of a sudden it just declines very quickly. And our days are just like the shadow. And Epaphroditus, he realized this. And he realized that whether it is by death or even by continuing in life, that I'm going to continue. And I'm going to put my neck on the line for the cause of Christ. Now, have you that commitment to Christ? Remember, Christ has committed himself to you. Committed himself to the bitter and the very end to save you from your sin and to redeem you. Are you reciprocating that same commitment to the work of God, to the worship of God, to the witness of God, to fellowshipping with believers, to being a fellow soldier, and to furthering the gospel just like this man? You pleasant Christian. You know, in the city of Carthage, a couple of 100 years after Christ went to heaven, there was a great plague and many died. And one of the early church fathers was a man named Cyprian. And Cyprian at that stage was the bishop of Carthage. And he took time to care for the sick, and he encouraged his congregation to care for the sick and to care for the dying. And one of the main reasons he did that was because the ungodly, the pagans, they were literally taking corpses, throwing them outside the city, not being careful with them at all, and just running away from the plague, from the illness, from the great plague. Commitment. What activity. What a man this man Epaphroditus was. What a pleasant, what a comely Christian he was. So I've thought about his appellations and his activity in terms of this other shining light. But think with me lastly about his arrival. Verse 29 we read, "Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation." So we've discerned that whenever he was in Rome, he fell sick. In actual fact, he nearly died. Now, as he began to come to and get better, you really begin to see the heart of this man. Look at verse 26. This is Epaphroditus. He longed after you all, was full of heaviness. Why was he full of heaviness? Because that ye had heard that he had been sick. What had happened was Epaphroditus, whilst he was sick and near death, the Philippian believers, obviously they had heard about it. And as he began to get better, and this is very nearly humorous in a sense, if it doesn't show you the man, but he was worried about them worrying about him. You know what it's like. You know some people like that, I'm sure. And they're going through an illness and they're asking about everybody else around them. Verse 26 says he was full of heaviness because they had heard that he was sick. And so Paul felt it necessary whenever he began to get better, because even as he said in verse 27, God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, verse 28, I carefully sent him again to you, that ye may rejoice. So Paul sent him back to Philippi to encourage the saints so that they wouldn't be overwhelmed with worry. But as he sent them back, the thing that really I want to just leave with you as we bring this to a close is Paul's counsel in verse 29. It's very telling. Paul tells the Philippian believers to receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. Here was someone who was sent to do a specific job by this church. And he's coming home now on health grounds, let's put it that way. He's coming home, maybe he's coming home earlier than they expected. He's coming home, and I just wonder in this church, whether one or two are thinking to themselves, was he really near death? Did Paul not overemphasize it a bit? Sure, Paul's a bit of a fanatical character, isn't he? Was he really near to death? Some maybe cynically were thinking. Did he really complete and accomplish the task that we had sent him to do? And so Paul, understanding this, detecting this potentially, he tells them in verse 29 to receive him and to respect him. Receive him and respect him. Receive him with gladness. What does that mean? He's essentially saying to this church, be glad in the Lord for the grace that God had given to him and the mercy he had shown to him, obviously in raising him up, but even how he had enabled him to do this work, to be a blessing to Paul and to preach the gospel in Rome. Don't receive him cynically and call him a quitter. Don't receive him and question him about the validity of his illness and all of these sort of things. That's really what he's saying. Receive him with gladness. But not only receive him with gladness, hold him in reputation. because of his work's sake, that's really what it's getting at. Because of the hundreds of miles that this servant of God has travelled, because of the fact that he's put his neck, his own life on the line and nearly died, was near to death for the work of Christ, holds such in reputation. The word has the idea of honour, value highly, praise, deem precious. Respect him for his work's sake. That's really the thought here. And we need to bear that in mind, folks, that when we receive each other, or we receive especially those in service in God, in the Lord's work, there are circumstances within the local assembly and even those potentially in full-time service, and they have to return early from the field. Various circumstances. Some, maybe they finish early because of health grounds. There are all sorts of reasons and all sorts of things that go on in the work of God. And to such, we are to receive and we are to respect and we are to esteem them very highly for their work. I was reading someone this week and they made a very, very, very firm point. I'm not going to make it as firm as him, but he made the point that very often some people, they make statements and comments about people who have given their lives and maybe they've had to come home for various reasons. And some people maybe make derogatory remarks about them or talk belittlingly about their work. And maybe they haven't shared the gospel for a year or two themselves. Haven't even went next door. And folks, we need to keep that in mind. We need to have a perspective, a balanced perspective in the work of God. That things happen, folks. Sometimes there are things and things come, and sometimes people have to stop for a little while or they cease. But we should respect such. Does 1 Thessalonians 5:13 not tell us? That we beseech you, this is Paul again, brethren, to know them which labour among you, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, and be at peace among yourselves. I think that verse is so telling. Those who are over us in the work of God, you show them respect and you show them esteem for their work's sake, because of the work that they do. And the command then that follows that is be at peace among yourselves. If you do this, there will be no discord, there will be no kind of belittling the word of God or the man of God or the servant of God or the woman of God, whatever it might be. And again, that's what it looks like, folks, to be a beautiful Christian. To see someone going through a difficulty and to exhibit brotherly love to them and esteem them highly for their work's sake and thank God for their work. I'm thinking here about missionaries now especially. Those who do years of service and maybe they come home or they go through difficult times. We're to esteem them very highly. And I trust that we'll be a Philadelphia. Philadelphia means brotherly love. We looked at the church at Philadelphia. That we'll all be brotherly love kinds of Christians. And that we'll exhibit this kind of pleasant Christianity. Individually and collectively as a body. Because this is what it is to shine as a light for Jesus Christ. And I trust that these thoughts again will be a help and a blessing to us. Our time's gone, folks. We just commit our time to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank